So Peter, we were just talking about political polarization, ways of breaking through, the importance of movement. And one thing, and also what you learned from talking to Trump supporters, and we left off in this idea of that it's kind of fun to fight. You know, I was talking with Monica Guzman, who published this book. I never thought of it that way, from Braver Angels. And, you know, here we are out walking, and that's kind of like a good step in the right direction to bridge divides, as you mentioned. But how do we, it seems like you need two willing partners to begin with. So how do you, and if, you know, if I might just throw in this little opinion of mine that, you know, political fighting is almost like an addiction. So how do you break the addiction? You know, is it that first step saying, I don't want to do this anymore? Or what is that very first step?
Yeah, so you're right, it is an addiction. There's research, there's neuroscientific research on this, that when we get a taste of outrage from something we see on Twitter, we feel the desire for retaliation. It fires at parts of our brain that are fired by narcotics. So, and unfortunately, the business models of media and social media understand that.
Oh yeah.
And so they're playing into that addiction. So it is an addictive substance or process. So there are different ways to break through it. You know, it's never simple. One is simply being miserable, right? Like if you're done with vitriol and hate, and you see it as toxic for yourself or your family or your kids, and you really want to just, you know, pivot and do something else, that for the purposes of moving out of this is good. It is like an addict hitting bottom, or having their family intervene on them and saying no more, right? So those conditions are good. But there are other ways to engage people in what we're doing right now, like national service, right? When people go and work for Habitat for Humanity, and they're going out and building homes for the poor, right? And they're working actively together. They are often with people who politically differ from them, and they have these experiences, and particularly if they're longer term experiences of one another. They may at some point discover that there are political differences, but they become less central. And so it is just about suddenly you have an experience as somebody who's on the other side that is a, you know, decent experience of decency and competence and well-intentionedness, and then you hearing their political attitudes in that context can be less of a spoiler. Right? It can tip you less. So sometimes just bringing people together for other purposes and that's what, you know, the research shows is if you have mixed political marriages, right? Republicans and Democrats that marry, which of course has been on the decline in the US, but in some counties there are 25% of the marriages are mixed. In those spaces you've got parents and kids that grow up having different points of view. That's good for democracy, you know? And the loss of that is problematic. Similarly, people are today physically moving, you know, red and blue Americans are physically moving away from each other. Even in cities like this where you'll have neighborhoods that are acutely blue or acutely red. That's a problem because then, you know, you don't go to a store where there are Republicans. You don't go to a cafe where there are Democrats, and you don't have that sense of contact and kind of mundane life that can give you the kinds of relationships that at least give you a sense that people from the other side are decent.
That it's great to be open to that notion that, hey, maybe they are actually decent, or maybe they're not all actively evil. And so what I'm hearing is that there's a mix of being intentional about wanting to bridge divides, or just almost or accidental, whether it's, you know, I've hit rock bottom, or I've just had enough, or I could speak to getting burnt out a bit, and wanting to take a step back and saying, you know, how do we, you know, preserve democracy? It's getting, you know, threatened within and without and all over the place. So are there any stories or any individual people that you have met over, you know, your research or writing your book that you would want to echo for this interview?
Well, one of the things I was just going to say is, you know, these experiences of contact with the other side don't have to be happenstance. There are places like Botswana that have policies which are intentionally designed to move people from different ethnic tribes to different parts of the country every 7 years. They have a policy that they implemented decades ago because they got independence at the same time Mozambique and Angola did. Those two nations burst into ethnic war, civil wars, and they were trying to avoid that. So they implemented a policy that said that all civil servants, which is like 50 or 60% of their working population, every 7 years need to physically move to a different part of the country and live there for 7 years and then move again. And as inconvenient as you can imagine that is, what they believe is that these people are ambassadors and they have this more multicultural society, more tolerance. It's the most prosperous and one of the most peaceful nations on the continent. And they think that largely these kinds of top-down policy structures enforce that, encourage that, right? So there can be intentionality by leadership, or it can be something that we choose to do. But you asked me about individuals.
Yeah, if there's a story of somebody who it really struck you as, you know, they were able to cross the divide or, you know, overcome some doubts that they had.
Yeah, so I mean, again, there are the good news is there are hundreds of thousands of those stories. One of the things we studied is, you know, they measure political tolerance in, you know, in America has 330 counties. Sorry, 3,030 counties. And they measure the degree of political tolerance within each. And so we studied the 1%, you know, like the counties that actually are able to do that. And they are in strange places. They're in, a lot of them are in Texas, North Carolina, upstate New York. In fact, Jefferson County, which is in upstate New York, is one of the most tolerant, right in the middle of Trump country. It's by an army base. It's went for Trump, I think, in the last election by 30 points. And high levels of political tolerance. And that is because high levels of mixed red and blue marriages, spaces where people come together for breakfast and talk politics every week, in an ongoing way. So again, they have these kind of civic spaces where you build relationships with people. And as one of the reverends that cooks this breakfast said, the reason that we get along is because we talk about issues long enough until we realize what we don't understand. Because, you know, think about immigration. Immigration is this immensely complex set of moral, legal issues, right? And yet we simplify it into, should there be a wall or should there not be a wall or some other inane distinction. What they do in these breakfasts is that they talk about it, and they start to realize, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. Well, that's a whole other conversation. And that is humbling, but it is also reality, you know, and it's not just our subjective tribal view of reality. It's, you know, what we have to understand.
And, you know, being in that shared space, you know, shared experience, sharing food, like those are things that are just ancient and seemingly eroding, you know, with time and also in this virtual world we kind of live in. And so any other, before we kind of close up, any other tips or ideas for the CivicList community?
Well, I guess, you know, what I have to think of is, you know, there are groups in this world that, so there's a colleague of mine named Andrea Bartoli, who's a world-class peacemaker, and he works in, you know, situations of international deadly conflict. So he works in some of the worst places in the world. For the past few years, he's been in South Sudan, trying to do back channel work in South Sudan. And one of the premises of his group, he works for a Roman Catholic NGO called the Community of San Egidio. One of their premises is that they will talk to anybody. So the Janjaweed may be committing horrific crimes, the international community shuns them, nobody will talk to them except the community. And the community will actively reach out to them. Oftentimes because there are people on the ground who are members of the community who are trusted by these warlords, and so conversations can happen. Their premise is, if we don't talk to them, what are our options, right? If and of course, you know, presidents, prime ministers can't talk to them for obvious reasons, but a community-based NGO that's there working on extreme poverty can, and they're sometimes trusted in a place to broker conversations, and if those conversations can introduce a doubt, a sense of possibility, some movement, right? Some movement about imagining something that they couldn't even imagine, then it starts a pathway to peace. And that's what their work shows us, is that they've been able to promote peaceful dialogue in places where it was impossible.
Wow.
So that's I think just a metaphor for us.
Yeah.
We're not there now. We could be there soon.
Right.
So
hope not.
So I think it's important to look at people that navigate those spaces effectively and help basically mitigate the worst.
Yeah, just have that conversation. Just be willing to be open, be willing to be surprised.
Yeah, and of course, I work in this space. I'm not Christ-like. I get enraged. I get triggered. None of us are perfect. But if there is an intentional willingness to try to understand, to try to find, not just finding common ground, because sometimes that's even too far, too much to ask, but finding decency in one another and some kind of an appreciation for one another. And sometimes that does start with taking a walk.
I think we could definitely do that. That sounds like another form of movement that works for you. So yeah, we've come full circle. So thank you so much.